Hi, welcome to another video. In this class, we're looking at this idea of mental health, right? And we're looking at how we can go about like coaching it and trying to cultivate it and trying to foster it or develop it or try to help, and how we do that at at our kind of own life level, and how we try to do that in our families, and how we try to do that into the communities, and then also into our professional work with client populations. And it's like, part of my point in this course is this is actually a difficult question. This question of how do we like help people improve their mental health in a time when people's mental health is really struggling. And one of the ideas I want to do this week in the course is look at this idea of who we are as humans and take that question at its deepest level and look at what does it mean to, take a deep look at some of our evolutionary past and how that helps us understand ourselves, but also ourselves socially, and how we've evolved in this social context, and how that has such a huge influence on all these things related to our mental health and our kind of cognitive, social, emotional functioning in our modern society. So, what I want to do with this presentation is sort of do a combination of, I have some videos that I'm just going to show, and then there's some I'm going to show and watch with you, and then like kind of comment on. And I'm doing this one to sort of set up the next one, because in the next presentation I want to sort of start at the beginning of recorded time, and I want to look at this idea of how did the development of philosophy and technology sort of go together, and this idea of how as humans changed and as they used new tools, it had these changes in thought, and that and it changed how we lived, and it changed how we associated with each other, and it changed what we valued. And all these things are relevant for understanding the kind of owner's manual of the human being that's going to be so important as we sort of attempt at the end to tie this course together and relate it all to sort of practical ways to try to build long-term sustainable mental health, holistic mental health. So welcome. That was a kind of ranty intro, but I hope that you are having a good day and are interested in this topic. We're going to be looking at how an understanding of this early human time period is important, and can add layers to our understandings of like, yeah, kind of modern psychology. All right, let's get into it. Early humans, 4306, mental health coaching. Let's do it. I just went on an epic huge rant about how I think an understanding of like ancient history has relevance to a current discussion of mental health, and then I accidentally re-recorded like nothing over top of it, so I lost it. So I spared you the rant, but like I'll try to make it again at some point throughout this. And one of the points I really wanted to hit is like, okay, when you're looking at this, what I want you to look at is this is a breakdown of the family tree of the evolution of primates. And a lot of times, you maybe when you were younger heard people talk about, like when they're talking about early human origins, that it's like, well, it's either a religious interpretation or it's this kind of evolution idea. And you're probably told of evolution as sort of meaning this idea of like chimps turning into humans, and you probably understood that it was more complicated than that, but like that idea was somewhere there in how people talked about it, especially people that like had limited understanding of it, that it was somehow this idea of like ape to man. And it's like, uh, what I want to look at a little bit is the complexity in the fossil record, and it's actually pretty interesting because it's like the connection between chimps and humans is fascinating, but obviously chimps didn't turn into humans, or else there wouldn't still be chimps. But chimps are closer to humans than they are even to gorillas, which is what you see if you see those first three, right? So it's like humans and then chimps and then gorillas and then orangutans and then gibbons. And it's looking at like kind of then the old world monkeys and the new world monkeys and the lemurs. So it's like all these primates shared common ancestors. So all those things on that list shared common ancestors. at least anatomically. Right, so here's the thing, right? It's like, and this is where this evolution question is interesting in it. It's like, well, I guess it's just at a most fundamental level. It's like, what does it mean to, and just let your mind think about that idea of like having a shared ancestor. It's not coming from, but it's a shared ancestor. And so then we're going to see that there's actually lots of different hominids. And so, yeah, well, I'll kind of like explain this as it goes. And again, I want to make this point a couple times. On Earth right now, every single human being is a Homo sapiens sapien. But that hasn't always been the case. And there's been times in human history where there's been multiple forms of hominids on Earth at the same time. And you've probably heard of Neanderthals before, and you've maybe heard of Homo erectus or Homo neanderthals, like the actual name. Those are definitely, if you've only heard of a couple, those are definitely probably the most common. Okay, so let's check this out. Oh, I thought that had glitched, but I think it's still okay. I gotta click in the middle of the video. We shared a common ancestor that lived 7 million years ago. This is coming again from the Museum of Natural History in New York City, but we have much closer relatives, hominids, who are no longer living. We know about these through fossils, and nowadays also somewhat through DNA. I'll just kind of like narrate this, I guess. Okay, so the fossil represents where the fossil's found, and then the glow around it represents how far they think that species got, the range of species, they said there. And then, yeah, across the bottom goes the timeline towards today. And 7 means 7 million years ago. First known hominid, 7 million years ago. Canine teeth, similar to smaller apes. Were smaller than earlier apes. So already multiple species, probably walking upright already by like around 6 million years ago. Bipedal, walking on 2 feet. Right, so they're inferring that from the fossil record. So this ability to walk on 2 feet evolved long before things like our cognitive abilities. And then there's this interesting time before like a little more than 5 million years ago to like, a little more than 4 million years ago, where there's like very little in the fossil record, which is just fascinating because obviously things were happening. But it's just sort of lost. The most interesting Netflix documentary that'll never be made is what happened then. So here, like, watch that toe, boom. So you can see, like, your baby toe is different if you're tree bound. Right around 4 million years ago, that grasping toe is lost. Australopithecus. So now you're starting to see, like, even there's a few different Australopithecus. You'll see there's like 3 or 4. They may have met, right? That just said that like their ranges. I stopped narrating. I should keep going, but that the ranges may have overlapped. By 3 million years ago, hominids were living in southern Africa. Right, so that's kind of interesting because even though we kind of think of it as coming out of Africa, for some reason you don't think of it as getting to South Africa as later, but it's starting in the middle, right? So in Ethiopia, we see the first use of stone tools. Homo habilis. So you can also see the word habitat there, right? So you're starting the use of home tools, almost like earliest civilization in a way, right? Like spearheads and needles and stuff. Homo erectus. Right, so Homo erectus on top right, the first hominid that we see evidence of reaching outside of the continental Africa, right, and to start to get into Europe and Asia, the Eurasian continent. Homo erectus had human-like traits, such as the large brain. Right, then notice this other one that creeps up in the kind of northwestern Europe. Interesting. Dexterous fingers, like you do. Longer legs. Better for walking. Not as good for holding in a tree. Around 800,000 years ago, advances in cooking were fueling further brain growth, right? Releasing all these like minerals and nutrients in the meats. Neanderthals, Homo nadali. You can see a video about some of these in a second. Our own species, Homo sapiens, emerged in Africa about 200,000 years ago. And again, I wanted to kind of go with like a pretty standard interpretation of this, right? This is like, well, it's the American Museum of Natural History that did this, so it's like just like a pretty standard. This is pretty as mainstream as it gets for this kind of stuff. Climate pressures, competition with other Homo sapiens, like definitely war. So this all gets, watch how they do this artistically, I won't blow it. It's kind of cool. Although these ancient hominids are now extinct, they remain. And see what that said? Maybe they remain, like in how they affect us, because like there is definite genetic remnants, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a second, because I'm going to talk about, I got a slide coming up about Neanderthal DNA where I'll talk about that specifically. All right, so I hope you find this interesting. Again, this is sort of outside the, not outside the course, but outside of what you're immediately going to be evaluated on. It's going to be more like what we started with last week. This week I'm kind of doing like a theory deep dive, and it's going to start with this. This is my prehistory, and then yeah, history is basically like since people started writing things down. Prehistory is since before that. This is prehistory. The next presentation will basically be history. I don't know why I felt the need to explain that. You probably know that. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I would like to try out this new feature. I don't know if this is gonna work, but this is like the screen recorder in PowerPoint. But I wanted to, I'll make this website available to you. This is a really cool one if you're interested in this topic and want to look a little bit more into it. And what they've done here is they've taken all the different species like Australopithecus. If you click on it, it gives like, I hope that you can see this now, it gives this like detailed look into all the kind of details about it. And it shows the red line here represents its range of where, when we think, or when, not when we think, when the fossil record shows evidence of it, of this line of the family tree existing. Right, and across the bottom you can see the graph of a million years ago. So this is sort of similar to the other video. This is from the Smithsonian Institute. So you'll see here across the bottom these major evolutionary milestones. So like this first one is like starting to walk upright, full bipedalism, the use of tools like stone tools, and the first kind of, that's a spearhead. Then you see here like the fire, this huge change in brain size, right? That this rapid increase of brain size between 800 and 200,000 years ago. So they put this way back. Human brain size evolved most rapidly during this time of dramatic climate change. Larger, more complicated, complex brains enabled early humans from this time period to interact with each other and their surroundings in new, different ways. As environments became more unpredictable, bigger brains helped our ancestors survive. So just like interesting stuff like that, they have like little points like that, or like the beginning of farming. You can see like here's Homo sapiens up at the top here, right? You are here from roughly, now this goes back, this puts the range at 300,000 years ago. So this is, if this works, I'm going to embed this video straight into the presentation, and I'll put this link to, and you can like magnify and go in all in on the different parts. So yeah, the major milestones, the different species, and then it's kind of interesting to look at how like climate played a role. You can click on these purples to look at these like major changes, right? There's a major increase in how variable the climate was around 6 million years ago. Or like, let's just see what another one is. Let's like what this one is. Rise in worldwide fluctuations again, right? So it's kind of like just looking at the differences in how climate affected things too. So that's pretty cool, interactive, clickable page. If you're ever trying to kind of think something through or show a friend or something, this is like the best I've ever seen at somebody sort of mapping it all out in like a clickable website. So I feel like I'm doing this a little bit out of order, and sometimes I move around the slides, but like by this point in the presentation, you will have seen that video that was like the 10 extinct um, past kinds of hominids. And oh, I wish I had been able to see your face watching that. It's like I'm sure that some of them you'd heard of, or maybe some of you hadn't heard of any of those, and that must have been really surprising. You saw like the hominidales where they had to go down that deep cave. They found that huge stash of like thousands, like whole skeletons. And then the Hobbit, obviously, like the Homo floresiens, from like the Indonesia area, and the Red Deer Cave people, and then like Heidelbergus. I always thought that was the very first one was like Homo heidelbergus, which I always thought was so interesting because just because my parents live in a town called Heidelberg. I lived in Heidelberg. Just feels like it's named after that town, which is obviously named after like the bigger German town. Okay. Anywho, so Neanderthal DNA. This is what I wanted to say about this. Is like I want you to kind of just even sit back and just hopefully just enjoy and find this presentation kind of interesting and just think about this idea. And I wanted to, because I'm not gonna like, you don't have to be scrambling to like learn everything there is to know about Neanderthals, although that would be a fun hobby. The point of this is just to make the context as full as possible, and some of this is pretty interesting. And there's actually a lot of science, and the reason I wanted to show something like this is like I'm not pulling like super fringe random sources, right? Like this is another Museum of Natural History video, and this is looking at this idea of how traces of Neanderthal DNA existed in or have survived in the modern human genome of certain groups. Right, so mainly like people of Western European origin, right? And it's interesting because there's Denisovian DNA examples, and like you saw that in the video that you've already watched now, where it was saying that like they found interesting links to the Tibetan people, right? And how it might even be linked to some of the Tibetans' demonstrated ability to like basically deal with oxygen better in tighter pressure atmospheric conditions, right? So basically like at high altitude or whatever. And it's like that might be a genetic, which is just fascinating. So again, if you're interested in this, where it's going to be, where like future findings will come from will be either genetics or new kind of fossil findings. All right. Yeah, this is a cool video. So think of this, only 30,000, right? So that one video that we showed that was like talking about how humans have been around 30, they think like maybe as much as 300,000 years at our current Homo sapien level. 30,000 years, these Neanderthals were still around, which means our ancestors definitely crossed paths with them, which is pretty wild of a thought. Neanderthals became extinct about 30,000 years ago, but many people today carry portions of their DNA. Yes, I shouldn't have taken a drink. Like, oh man, I was gonna make my point. I'm like taking a drink, but it's like 5 minutes in. I'm not redoing this slide. Researchers recently decoded the highest quality sequence yet of Neanderthal genome. To me, that's like so interesting. They actually have the DNA. They're now using the data to characterize Neanderthal traces in our own genetic makeup, right? So they know what to look for. When modern humans migrated from Africa to Europe, some bred with Neanderthals, our close relatives, Neanderthal DNA survives in their descendants. In trace levels, right? Meaning in small levels, big enough that you can find a trace of it. Many Neanderthal genes are scattered across people of non-African descent, so I said before, I think mainly Western European. Scientists recently identified some of the Neanderthal genes that survived in humans, linking them to the production of hair, nails, and skin. Yeah, because a lot of Neanderthals had red hair, which is interesting. These genes could have given migrating humans an advantage, helping them to adapt to cool, wet northern climates. Sorry, I'm doing this on the big screen, so this window is a little bit small. The reading. By studying how modern human DNA combined with that of our ancient extinct relatives, scientists can better trace the traits that define our species. Yeah, that's so fascinating, right? That they can crack that whole genome. I should have looked into this before, but I remember hearing a long time ago that they found very preserved specimens or just samples, right? Yeah, they have actual DNA material, which is fascinating.
Life. With an estimated 3.8 billion years of existence and evolution on Earth, it's an odd thing indeed. So how did we get here? And what would the Earth's 4.5 billion year timeline look like compressed into a normal day of 24 hours? The story begins early in the morning, around 4 a.m., with the rise of the first simple, single-celled organisms. However, these organisms are destined to spend quite some time alone. At 1 p.m., a simple cell engulfs another, creating a symbiotic relationship and the first eukaryotic cells, or cells with internal organs. At 6:30 p.m., these cells begin to form colonies, and thus the first multicellular life develops. But it isn't until 8:30 p.m. that sea plants appear, and 20 minutes later we suddenly see animal life erupt in an explosion of inventiveness. Jellyfish, the first true vertebrates, trilobites. Incredible diversification begins to take place, and just before 10 p.m., plants begin to appear on land, followed by land mammals. By 1024, the Earth is covered in carboniferous forests, and the first winged insects appear. Many reptiles dominate the land with less than an hour left, but a mass extinction event allows dinosaurs to storm the scene and remain. until 11:41 p.m. when they too suddenly vanish. And so begins the age of mammals. In the last few minutes, apes split from the old world monkeys, and with only 1 minute and 17 seconds left before midnight, humans emerge. All of the recorded human history fits within a few seconds, an individual life lasting barely an instant. All a culmination of 3.8 billion years of life. This ASAP Science video was made possible by the support of Audible.com. With their help, we're able to continue making fun science videos, and they want to give you a free audiobook. Audible is the internet's leading provider of audiobooks with more than 100,000 downloadable titles across all different types of literature, including fiction, nonfiction, and periodicals. Just go to audible.com/ASAP to get a free audiobook of your choice. Today's episode was inspired by the book A Short History of Nearly Everything, in which Bill Bryson explores the neatest bits of science, my personal recommendation. Again, just head over to audible.com/ASAP to download it for free or another audiobook of your choice. And subscribe for more weekly science videos.
The world we live in feels normal, ordinary. It feels like this is just how humans exist and always existed. But it's not. Never before have we humans lived in a world as sophisticated and engineered to our needs as today, giving us the luxury to forget about ourselves and not worry about survival. Food, shelter, security, all of this is more or less taken for granted. But we're a special few. For more than 99.99% of human history, life was completely different. And there's no such thing as just one human history.
Yeah, so this video is like, I guess I can't really check mid-video here, but I think it's about 7 or 8 minutes. And then, and I know this has been a kind of different presentation, but I just had a bunch of videos I wanted to show, and I was going to do a reaction sort of in every single one, but I thought the flow would maybe be a bit better paced and a bit more manageable presentation, like if I just like, because I want to do another presentation this week too, if I kind of left some parts just the video. And I want to do that again at the very end. So after this slide, there's one last video. And if you want to watch it, I would recommend sticking around for it, because the guy does an awesome job at talking about how like the biology of Darwin and these ideas of evolution and how that has relevance to psychology, sort of. He makes that link. But it's more just like a look at who Darwin is and how his role in all of this. Because then what we're going to get into next week is like, because Darwin and Freud were like not completely contemporaries, but it's like, because Darwin's a little bit before, right? But like definitely hitting the collective mind at roughly the same time, right? Like the ideas of evolution and psychoanalysis, or like basically let's say evolution and the unconscious. Two of the most groundbreaking ideas possible. Okay, so what we're going to do, watch this video, and then the next thing is going to be the Darwin thing, and then it's going to end. But then the next presentation that's going to come is going to be much more like a traditional lecture with like only a few videos, but like much more me presenting slides, and I might actually try doing it in Prezi or in StreamYard or one of the other apps. But yeah, let's get back to this video.
Our story begins 6 million years ago, when the tribe of Hominini split and our relationship with the apes ended. 2.8 million years ago, the genus of Homo, the first humans, emerged. We like to think of ourselves as the only humans, but this is far from the truth. When we, Homo sapiens sapiens, came into existence 200,000 years ago, there were at least 6 other human species around. Cousins of comparable intelligence and ability, which must have been incredibly scary, kind of like living with aliens. Some of them were very successful. Homo erectus, for example, survived for 2 million years.
Sorry everyone if this is like, the audio with this video sounds like a little bit scratched or something, but I think it's worth it. So yes, think about this. Like, think how wild that is. So let's just say, like, let's just use like the arguments that were presented, whatever, in the earlier video, that like Homo sapiens, I think they're about to say here, maybe 300,000 years. Homo erectus, they think, was on Earth for 2 million years. That's way longer than our species, or than Homo sapiens sapiens. It's mind-blowing.
Times longer than modern humans have existed. The last of the other humans disappeared around 10,000 years ago. We don't know what caused them to die out. Modern humans have at least a few % of Neanderthal and other human DNA, so there was some mixing, but certainly not enough to be a merger between species. So we don't know if our cousins went away because they lost the battle over resources or because of a series of minor genocides. Either way, only we remain. Back to the beginnings of humanity. 2.8 million years ago, early humans used tools, but did not make a lot of progress for nearly 2 million years. Until they learned to control fire. Fire meant cooking, which made food more nutritious, which contributed to the development of our brain. It also produced light and warmth, which made days longer and winters less gruesome. On top of that, it not only scared predators away, it could also be used for hunting. A torched wood or grassland provided small animals, nuts and tubers that were pre-roasted. From 300,000 years ago, most of the different human species lived in small hunter-gatherer societies. They had fire, wood and stone tools, planned for the future, buried their dead, and had cultures of their own. But most importantly, they spoke to each other, probably in a kind of proto-language less complex than ours. If we had a time machine, how far would we be able to go back, steal a few babies, and raise them today without anyone noticing that they're a bit different? There is much debate. Anatomically modern humans emerged 200,000 years ago, but probably 70,000 years is as far as we could travel back and still snatch a behaviorally...
Interesting, eh? Because like this site, in a nutshell, there's another name, like Kurzgesagt or something with a K, but like this YouTube channel makes awesome videos and really good information, and they're saying 200,000 years ago, or BC, so 200,000, and 202,000 years ago. But yeah, it's like the other video said 300,000, right? So it's like you can see even in these two videos, like that's obviously a massive difference. It's a difference of 100,000 years. It's a pretty significant difference. Just shows that like this isn't like a settled story at all, not at all. But yeah, then I kind of paused right when they're making this point that it seems that like at 70,000 years there's this major jump in brain activity.
Modern human. Before that, the babies would probably lack a few crucial gene mutations necessary to build a brain with modern language and abstract thinking abilities. At some point around 50,000 years ago, there was an explosion in innovation. Tools and weapons became more sophisticated, and culture became more complex, because at this point, humans had a multi-purpose brain and a more advanced language to communicate information with each other effectively and down to the last detail. This allowed much closer cooperation and is what really makes us different from any other creature on Earth. Not our comparatively weak bodies and inferior senses, but the ability to cooperate flexibly in large groups, unlike, for example, rigid beehives or intimate but tiny wolf packs. As our brain evolved, we became able to do something life had been unable to do up to this point. 1. Expand knowledge quickly. 2. Preserve the knowledge gained over generations. 3. Build on past knowledge to gain even deeper insights. This seems daft, but until then, information had to be...
Right, that's basically what civilization is, right? This idea that like you don't have to reinvent everything. It's like you can benefit from the fact that people before you, well, I don't know, let's just use like one of a million examples, developed the ability to harness electricity, something that could easily kill you, doesn't take a huge jolt to the heart, but somehow humans before us have like completely mastered it to the point that like it's like making all these devices work and the lights and or just light bulbs or like everything. It's like think of a squirrel. It's like the squirrel doesn't benefit from the stored knowledge of all squirrels. Maybe through behavioral genetics to some like mind, some like kind of intrinsic behavioral level, but not to the level of like at a level of like cognitive conscious knowledge. Except through things like direct parenting, right? And direct like mimicking and stuff. So it's like that ability to share stuff over time is so huge.
Be passed on from generation to generation, mostly through genetics, which is not efficient. Still, for the next 40,000 years, human life remained more or less the same. There was little to build upon. Our ancestors were only one animal among many. Building a skyscraper without knowing what a house is hard. But while it's easy to be arrogant in our attitude to our ancestors, this would be ignorant. Humans 50,000 years ago were survival specialists. They had a detailed mental map of their territory, their senses were fine-tuned to the environment, they knew and memorized a great amount of information about plants and animals. They could make complicated tools that required years of careful training and very fine motor skills. Their bodies compared to our athletes today just because of their daily routines, and they lived a rich social life within their tribe. Survival required so many skills that the average brain volume of early modern humans might even have been bigger than it is today. As a group, we know more today, but as individuals, our ancestors were superior to us. But then, around 12,000 years ago in multiple locations, humans developed agriculture. Everything changed very quickly. Before, survival as a hunter and forager required superb physical and mental abilities in all fields from everybody. With the rise of the agricultural age, individuals could increasingly rely on the skills of others for survival. This meant that some of them could specialize. Maybe they worked on better tools. Maybe they took time to breed more resistant crops or better livestock. Maybe they started inventing things. As farming got more and more efficient, what we call civilization began. Agriculture gave us a reliable and predictable food source, which allowed humans to hoard food on a large scale for the first time, which is much easier to do with grains than meat. A food stock required protection, which led to communities living together in tighter spaces. First, early defense structures were built. The need for organization grew. The more organized we got, the faster things became efficient. Villages became cities, cities became kingdoms, kingdoms became empires. Connections between humans exploded, which led to opportunities to exchange knowledge. Progress became exponential. About 500 years ago, the scientific revolution began. Mathematics, physics, astronomy, biology and chemistry transformed everything we thought we knew. The Industrial Revolution followed soon after, laying the foundation for the modern world. As our overall efficiency grew exponentially, more people...
Right, real quick, agricultural revolution is just basically this massive change to farming, and then the industrial revolution is this massive change to people living in big cities and people working in factories and industry, industrial revolution, right?
People could spend their lifetime contributing to the progress of humanity. Revolutions kept happening. The invention of the computer, its evolution into a medium we all use on a daily basis, and the rise of the internet shaped our world. It's hard to grasp how fast all of that happened. It's been about 125,000 generations since the emergence of the first human species. About 7,500 generations since the physiologically modern human saw the light of day. 500 generations ago, what we call civilization began. 20 generations ago, we learned how to do science. And the internet became available to most people only one generation ago. Today, we live in the most prosperous age humanity has ever experienced. We have transformed this planet, from the composition of its atmosphere to large-scale changes in its landscape, and also in terms of the other animals in existence. We light up the night with artificial stars and put people in a metal box in the sky. Some have even walked on our moon. We put robots on other planets. We've looked deep into the past of the universe with mechanical eyes. Our knowledge and our way of acquiring and storing more of it has exploded. The average high school student today knows more about the universe than a scholar a few centuries ago. Humans dominate this planet, even if our rule is very fragile. We are still not that different from our ancestors 70,000 years ago, but your lifestyle has existed for less than 0.001% of human history. From here on, there's no saying what the future holds for us. We're building a skyscraper, but we're not sure if it's standing on a solid foundation or if we're building it on quicksand. Let's leave it with that for now. The next time you miss your train, your burger is not hot enough, or someone cuts in line, remember how special this made-up human world is. Maybe it's not worth being upset about all those little things. This video was supported by audible.com/nutshell. In the making of it, we used the book Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, as one of the major sources. If you want to get to it or any other book for free and support us, go to audible.com/nutshell and get a free 30-day trial. It's so hard to read books when you have the internet, so we can at least listen to them. In general, we listen to a lot of audiobooks while designing our videos, so we can highly recommend Audible.
It better be
Okay, this was our first take on making a history-related video. We'd love to make much more of them, but they take even more time than our average video. So we might do 3 or 4 a year. Your feedback's very welcome here. Thank you so much for watching, and if you want to support us directly, you can do so on Patreon. It really helps us out. While you think about it, here are more videos if you need more distraction.
Okay, I guess the outro's finally done. Okay, so the last thing of this presentation is going to be that Darwin-related video, right? And he's kind of talking about Darwin's role in this kind of... Well, talking about Darwin and his role in the early field of, or the emergence of evolution and where kind of biology touches and has ramification for understandings of psychology. All right, my friends, I'll catch you probably tomorrow or in the next couple days. Probably not tomorrow, but probably a bit later in the week I'll come out with the next one. But have a great week. Keep your heads held high. And yeah, I don't know. Have a good day. Cheers.
Charles Darwin, the mild-mannered son of a physician, was once described as the most dangerous man in England. In fact, many people considered him to be the agent of the devil himself, come to sow seeds of corruption among the faithful. His ideas struck like a storm at the very foundation of society, turning conventional religious thought on its head. Yet, just a few years earlier, he had his sights set on becoming a priest and devoting his life to God. In this week's Biographics, we investigate the life and the ideas of Charles Darwin. Charles Robert Darwin was born in Shrewsbury, England on February the 12th, 1809. His father, Robert, was a doctor, and his mother, Susanna, was the daughter of the famous potteries owner Josiah Wedgwood. Charles's grandfather was Erasmus Darwin, well known in his time as a scientist with unusual ideas. He wrote on a range of subjects, including travel by air, exploring by submarine, and evolution. Despite his learned father and eminent grandfather, Charles's early years were not outstanding. He attended Shrewsbury School, where the main lessons were in the classics, such as Latin. His schoolmasters and his father considered him to be a boy of very ordinary intelligence. Despite his apparent lack of promise, Charles showed a great interest in learning. But rather than studying Greek and Latin like most of the students of the time, he was taken with the English poetry of William Wordsworth and Lord Byron. When Charles was a teenager, science began to captivate him, so much so, in fact, that he had his brother Erasmus build a chemistry lab in a garden shed. In 1825, Charles attended Edinburgh Medical School in Scotland, but he was not a good medical student. He found the lectures dull and had to leave the operating theatre because he could not stand the horrors of surgery. One thing he did enjoy, though, was the study of taxidermy, which he learned from a former African slave named John Edmondson. During his second year in Scotland, Darwin joined the Plinian Society, a club for naturalists. He was taken with their intellectual debates, which exposed him to ideas of how man was created not by God, but by gradual changes in form over time. These ideas had been espoused by Charles's own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. While at the university, Darwin met a zoologist named Robert Grant, and the two became close friends. Grant has been credited with being the first person to interest Darwin in the theory of evolution. At this time, Charles began collecting fossils and learning more about animal life. To the great disappointment of his father, Charles quit medical school in 1827. He joined his uncle Josiah Wedgwood II for a trip to Paris. As he vacationed, his father, still fretting over his son dropping out of medical school, made plans for Charles to study for the clergy, enrolling him at Christ's College at Cambridge University. Despite the evolutionary ideas that had been filling his mind during his time at Edinburgh, Charles still held to a belief in creation. Later he wrote, "I did not then in the least doubt the strict and literal truth of every word in the Bible." During the summer before his studies began, Charles fell in love with a girl by the name of Fanny Owen, the sister of one of his friends. They spent long hours talking, riding horses, and playing cards. Darwin's theological studies at Cambridge began towards the end of 1827, but rather than getting immersed in the Bible, he developed a fondness for collecting beetles. He attended lectures on botany given by the Reverend John Stevens Henslow. Darwin saw this as a possible career path, and he pursued his studies with enthusiasm. By 1829, it became clear that Darwin had no interest in joining the clergy. He spent that spring break with the Reverend Frederick Hope, a noted entomologist. His obsession with the study of beetles saw no time for his budding romance with Fanny, and they broke up that following spring. Despite his general lack of interest in his clerical studies, Darwin passed his finals exam in January 1831, placing 10th in his class. Finished with school, he was all set to become a countryside clergy, albeit one with a deep scientific interest. But Reverend Henslow, who had become something of a mentor to Charles, suggested that he should see some of the world before he settled down to his posting. Darwin decided to take a trip to the Canary Islands off the coast of Spain. He planned to go with his friend Marmaduke Ramsay. They intended to study the geological formations on the islands. But before they could set sail, Ramsay died suddenly. Darwin was stricken with grief and could not travel to the islands. A few weeks later, though, he received a letter from Reverend Henslow informing him that there was an opening on a ship that may interest him, the HMS Beagle, which was bound for South America. The Beagle was being prepared as one of several ships scheduled to map South America. Robert Fitzroy, the captain of the Beagle, recognized that the long voyage would require for a variety of men to be on board for companionship. He was keen to have a scholar gentleman who could help describe the areas that were being charted, as well as to relieve the tedium between ports of call. When the opening presented itself, Darwin was keen to fill the spot. However, his father, Robert, refused to give his adult son permission to embark on the voyage. Robert continued to believe that Charles's interest in science was merely a passing fad, and that the young man remained adrift. It was left to Charles's uncle Josiah to step in and persuade his brother to give permission for his son to join the expedition. Charles then hastened to London to meet with Captain Fitzroy in the hope that the offer was still available. He was in luck, with plans for a September departure gradually moved back. The ship finally set sail on Tuesday, December 27th, 1831. Darwin found himself in a small cabin that was 9 feet by 11 feet long and only 5 feet high. Part of his cabin was taken up by one of the masts rising through it. From the start, he was seasick, a condition that remained over the next 5 years. On January 16th, 1832, the Beagle stopped at Cape Verde off the western coast of Africa. Here, Darwin found a band of fossil shells 45 feet above sea level. How, he wondered, could the fossils rise so high? After 23 days, the crew set out for Brazil, arriving in the port city of Salvador at the end of February 1832. Throughout the spring, the Beagle traveled along the Brazilian coast, stopping in many ports. At each stop, Darwin took long hikes, collecting many specimens. He collected a huge number of specimens, which he carefully catalogued and protected on board. Fitzroy and the crew, they considered considered his work worthless and his growing collection a load of junk, but to Charles they were precious scientific discoveries. Every few months he arranged for a shipment to be sent back to Reverend Henslow in Cambridge for safekeeping. From Brazil, the Beagle sailed to Patagonia, a large region of South America that is now Argentina. There Darwin collected fossils, bits of bone, and feathers that he had never before encountered. He struggled to accurately record their features in the hopes that more experienced naturalists could later help to identify them. From Patagonia, the Beagle went further to Tierra del Fuego. It was here that Darwin encountered native people who still dwelled in the jungle and were considered to be savages by the Europeans. By March of 1833, the crew of the Beagle began mapping the Falkland Islands, which the British had claimed from Argentina just months earlier. Fascinated by the bird and animal fossils found there, Darwin spent his time comparing the specimens with everything he had collected to date. The work that Darwin was immersed in was becoming so exhaustive that he recognized the need to take on a servant. He wrote home to his father, asking for the money to hire someone. When permission came back, he asked the ship's odd-job man, Sims Covington, to take on the role. Meanwhile, the letters that Charles had been sending back to Reverend Henslow were being read aloud to the Philosophical Society of Cambridge. This earned Darwin an early reputation as an excellent naturalist and observer. On Darwin's 25th birthday, Captain Fitzroy named the highest mountain in the Tierra del Fuego region Mount Darwin in Charles's honor. By 1834, the ship had sailed round Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America and crossed from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. During the summer, Darwin became quite ill. He was deemed too sick to continue the voyage and spent 4 frustrating months in Tierra del Fuego recovering. Historians believe that he had Chagas disease, which is a form of sleeping sickness. Darwin returned to the Beagle in November of 1834. The ship rounded Cape Horn and sailed up South America's west coast. On February the 20th, 1835, a great earthquake shook the region. Entering the port of Concepcion in Chile, Darwin saw the appalling damage. He also noted that the rocks around the harbor had been lifted almost a meter by the Earth's movements. Shellfish and seaweeds, which were normally near the water, were now high and dry. So could such catastrophic changes in the surroundings be linked to changes in plants and animals, is what he wondered. The Beagle now left South America and set sail across the Pacific Ocean. Almost 1,000 kilometers from the mainland, it anchored at a group of about 13 small rocky islands on the equator. These were, of course, the Galapagos Islands. Darwin was immediately struck by the strange nature of the birds, reptiles, and others that he found there. They seemed unique to these islands, yet they had many similarities to species found on the South American mainland. Stranger still, each island had its own kind of animal. One example was the giant tortoises, weighing more than 200 kilograms, which the ship's crew rode around like horses. The local people could tell which island a tortoise came from by the shape of its shell. Darwin was especially intrigued by one group of birds, the finches. They were mostly small and drab-brown in color, but each species had a slightly different size and shape of beak, allowing it to tackle a certain kind of food. Darwin noted in his notebook, "One might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in the archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends." The idea of evolution, well, it was beginning to take root. The Beagle sailed on across the Pacific to Tahiti, where Darwin fell in love with the misty peaks, tropical plants, colorful animals, and the simple, natural lifestyle of the local people. The journey continued on towards New Zealand and then Australia. He was shocked at the terrible living conditions of the local people. In their own lands, they were ruled over and made slaves by European settlers. This seemed to support his observations from the animal world that the stronger always took over from the weaker. The Beagle returned to Falmouth, England on the 2nd of October 1836. They had been away for 5 years. Darwin spent the next few years organizing and cataloging his vast collection of plants, animals, rocks, and fossils. By the summer of 1838, Darwin felt bold enough to share his radical ideas with his father, who took them in his stride. For the last several months, Charles had struck up a close relationship with his cousin Emma Wedgwood. However, when he brought up the subject of marrying Emma, his father warned that she came from a very strict family. Emma would never consider Darwin's theories as anything but heresy. Deeply in love, though, Darwin ignored his father's advice to curtail the romance. He mentions some of his notions regarding religion and nature to Emma, who was surprisingly understanding. Darwin juggled numerous tasks, from writing books to studying more fossils to watching apes and orangutans at the London Zoo. As he worked, he also continued his relationship with Emma. He proposed to her on November the 11th, 1838. The proposal was well received by both sides of the family. Arrangements were made for Darwin to receive a handsome annual sum of money from his father. This would allow the couple to live comfortably while Darwin continued retaining Covington's services, since research on his theory of evolution was still incomplete. Charles and Emma were married on January the 29th, 1839. The couple settled into a home in London which was already filled with scientific material. Shortly thereafter, Covington left Darwin's employment to make his own fortune. He was replaced by a man named Joseph Parslow. During the spring of 1839, Darwin carried out research on crossbreeding. He asked various experts, including farmers, questions about how they crossbred their animals. He filled page after page with his correspondences. In May, the multi-volume collection he wrote with Captain Fitzroy, narrative of the surveying voyages of the HMS Beagle, was finally released to the public. This celebration of the Beagle's voyage, it became a bestseller. Charles was now a respected scientist and author, and a member of the Royal Society. During the 1840s and 1850s, Darwin continued his research and writing. In 1842, he wrote a geology book entitled The Structure and Distribution of Coral Reefs, with 2 more geology books following in the next few years. As time went on, though, his health began to fail. He could only do a few hours of work each day. His illness, it was never identified, but it could have been the after effects of his tropical sickness while on his 5-year voyage. Despite his illness, he continued his research into the idea of evolution. He was becoming more and more convinced that species were not fixed and immutable. He had written a short version of his ideas in 1842, but decided to collect every scrap of information he could and write a lengthy book with masses of evidence for his theory. For many years, Darwin was reluctant to publish his ideas on evolution by natural selection. It meant that animals and plants evolved naturally. He now believed that God had not created them. However, most people at the time, including many scientists, still believed in the truth of the Bible. He knew that speaking out against the accepted teachings of the Bible was certain to offend and cause a storm of protest. Darwin may have never finished his work on evolution, but for a letter which arrived at his home in Kent in June 1885 from Malaysia. It was from another English naturalist, Alfred Wallace. Wallace knew that Darwin was interested in evolution, so with his letter he sent his summary of the theory. Darwin was amazed. All of the work he had so patiently done over the last 20 years was neatly described by Wallace. At a scientific meeting at the Linnean Society in London, the works of both Wallace and Darwin were read out in July of 1858. After that, Wallace agreed that Darwin, who had gathered far more evidence to support their joint theory, should carry on with the idea while he stood aside. Darwin did so, quickly finishing his great book. It was published on the 24th of November 1859, and it was called The Origin of Species. The publisher of Darwin's book, John Murray, read it before printing it and realized a great outcry would follow. As a result, he only printed 1,250 copies. These sold out almost at once, and a second edition was quickly produced. People, they were indeed outraged. Darwin was denying the truth that was in the Bible. Scientists lined up to have their say, with many criticizing Darwin. One clergyman called the quiet, mild-mannered Darwin the most dangerous man in England. But others quickly recognized the good science in Darwin's ideas and the vast amount of evidence which supported them. The biologist Thomas Huxley spoke for him in England, while Professor of Botany at Harvard University, Asa Gray, was his great supporter in North America. Darwin himself stayed in Kent and took little part in the arguments. So now the question arises, well, what did Darwin actually postulate in his famous book? Well, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, is a long but very readable book. It begins by looking at variation under domestication, including pigeons, horses, and garden flowers. Then it covers variation in nature and the problems of identifying a species. It shows how the offspring of parents are all similar but slightly different. These slight differences might give an individual a better chance of succeeding and staying alive. Later chapters deal with animal instincts, fossils, and the geographical manner of animals and plants, from mice to elephants. Yet he never explains the origin of any one species. As I mentioned, the origin of species shocked and angered many people, including Darwin's own family. To accept the theory of evolution meant accepting that the account in the Bible of creation of animal and plant species could not be true. Many scientists, they simply struggled to believe in both. Gradually, however, the theory of evolution by natural selection gained ground, and most scientists came to believe that Darwin was right. Darwin, he did not retire after The Origin of Species was published. He kept up his studies and researches and carried on with his experiments and nature observations. In 1871, he published Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. In this work, he concluded that humans are not the result of special creation, but that they have evolved along with other animals. Their ancestors could indeed be traced back far into prehistory. In the 1870s, Darwin's health improved, and in 1877 he was awarded a special degree by Cambridge University. He continued to write books about insect-eating plants, how plants grow and move, and how they encourage decay and enrich the soil. With Descent a huge success as well, Darwin divided his time between revising the two works. In April of 1874, he completed work on Descent's second edition. This was the last time he wrote about evolution. Between projects and illnesses, Darwin continued to refine his work. A decade after its first publication, the fifth edition of Origin was released. The sixth edition, published in 1871, used the word evolution for the first time. After a mild heart attack in December of 1881, Charles Darwin died several months later, peacefully at Down House, his home of nearly 50 years. He was 73 years old. By this time, the storm of protest over the origin of species had died away, and Darwin had become a national figure and one of the best-known scientific names of all time. He was laid to rest at Westminster Abbey, London, next to the great Isaac Newton. The funeral was attended by dozens of politicians, inventors, explorers, scientists, and artists, along with members of the scientific communities of many countries. So I really hope you enjoyed that episode of Biographics. If you did, there's a couple of things you could do right now. One is hit that like button below. Also, if you want more stuff like this, we put out brand new videos every Monday and every Thursday, so hit that subscribe button below. And subscribe button doesn't do what it used to on YouTube. If you actually want to get a notification about these videos, please do hit that bell button next to the subscribe button, and that'll send you a notification every time, every Monday and Thursday when we put out a new video. Also, if you want to watch something else right now, stuff from the archive, over there on the right. And as always, thank you for watching.